There's an unwritten rule among hikers. Never come down a mountain at night. Not because of the dark, not because of the footing, but because of something that lives on that trail and only comes out once the sun is completely gone. 4 people once broke that rule. Only 3 of them really came home. This is the story of the night they found a market that shouldn't have existed. Alex, Ben, Sean, and Ryan had been friends since high school. Out of a bigger group that used to hike together, these 4 were the only ones who never missed a trip. This time their destination was a stretch of the Appalachian Trail, known for its scenery, but also known for how few people ever hiked it compared to the more popular sections further north. The locals near the trailhead had their own stories about that stretch of mountain. Don't whistle after 6 in the evening, some said. Don't shout a friend's name too loud in the deep woods, because something out there might answer back, and it won't be your friend. Stories like that usually got written off as campfire talk by hikers as young as these 4. Alex was the most experienced of the group. He'd done more than 10 mountains before this one, and he was the one who usually held the map and called the rest breaks. Ben was the talker, always keeping the mood light even on the steepest climbs. Sean was quieter, but he was the one who noticed things first, the one who'd feel something was off before anyone else did. And Ryan, the youngest of the 4, was on his first real high-altitude hike. The first 2 days went fine. They pitched camp at the 3rd checkpoint, took in the view from up high, and planned to reach the summit on day 3 before heading back down the same day. Everything felt normal, right up until Ryan started to fall apart, just past the summit on the way down. Ryan started struggling around midday. His breathing turned ragged, his face went pale, and his pace kept slowing every few minutes. At first, Alex figured it was just fatigue, given this was Ryan's first time at this altitude. But by evening, Ryan wasn't getting better. His breath was short, his lips had a bluish tint, and he'd started slurring his words. Ben suggested they pitch the tents and wait it out until morning. But Alex looked at Ryan, saw how fast he was fading, and knew this wasn't ordinary exhaustion anymore. It looked like a serious case of altitude sickness. If we wait until morning, he could get a lot worse, Alex said. We need to move now, as fast as we can. Sean went quiet. He knew the stories the locals told about this trail, but he also knew Ryan couldn't wait. The 4 of them agreed, reluctantly. They'd head down that night. The sun was gone by the time they reached the trail below checkpoint 2. Their headlamps became the only light they had, cutting through a path lined with tall trees on both sides. Ben carried most of Ryan's gear so he could move lighter, while Alex kept him upright from the left side. At first, the descent felt normal. Night insects buzzed somewhere in the distance. Winds stirred the leaves now and then, and their own footsteps were the loudest thing in the forest. But the further down they went, the more Sean felt like something had changed. About an hour into the descent, Sean stopped walking. He held up a hand, signaling the others to stay quiet. "Listen," he said, low. There was nothing to hear. Not because the sound was faint, but because there was no sound at all. The insects that had been going strong minutes ago had gone completely silent. No wind through the leaves, no night birds. Even their own footsteps sounded muffled now, like the forest itself was swallowing every noise they made. Ben tried to crack a joke to break the tension, but his own voice sounded wrong to him, flat, like talking inside a soundproofed room. He stopped mid-sentence. Alex checked his compass in the map. Everything still pointed the right way, the same trail they'd hiked up on. But somehow the woods around them felt different. Trees they'd used as landmarks on the way up now looked unfamiliar, like they'd wandered onto a trail none of them had ever walked before. Ryan, who'd been drifting in and out of awareness from exhaustion, suddenly mumbled something. His eyes were half open, fixed on something far ahead of them. "Someone's selling something," he murmured. The other 3 looked at each other. There was nothing in front of them but a dark trail lit by their headlamps. A few minutes after Ryan's mumbling, the dead silence broke. Not with a natural sound, but with something far more unsettling, because it sounded so completely normal in a place where it had no business being. The sound of a crowd. Like a night market, plates clinking together, people haggling over prices, faint laughter, dozens of footsteps on packed dirt. Underneath it all, the sharp smell of incense, the kind burned in ritual, not the kind you'd find at a campsite or a roadside stand. Ben was the first to react. "You guys are hearing that too, right? It's not just me?" Sean nodded slowly, his face tight. Alex tried to stay calm, swinging his headlamp toward the source of the sound. In the distance, dim yellow lights appeared, lined up like a row of market stalls along the edge of a road. "That's not possible," Alex said, more to himself than to the others. "There's no settlement out here. The map doesn't show anything." But the sound only got clearer the closer they got, like the trail itself was leading them straight to it. Ryan, who'd been weak and half-conscious moments earlier, suddenly started walking faster than the rest of them, like something invisible was pulling him forward. "Ryan, wait!" Ben tried to grab his arm, but Ryan shrugged him off with a strength that didn't match how drained he'd looked minutes before.
What appeared in front of them made no sense. A row of simple stalls lined the trail, roofed with worn tarps and lit by dim yellow oil lamps. Between the stalls stood figures that looked human at first glance. Some sold food laid out on woven trays. Some sat in front of their stalls, offering something to buyers whose faces were never quite clear. There was the ordinary hum of haggling, like any night market anywhere, as if there was nothing strange at all about a market existing deep in these mountains, miles from the nearest town. But something was off about all of it. Not one of those figures moved quite right. Their movements were a beat too slow, or sometimes too fast, like a video playing back at an inconsistent speed. Some turned their heads toward the four hikers in short, jerking motions, nothing like the way a human neck actually moves. Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He'd heard stories like this before. Ghost markets that only appear on certain nights. Places where people could get lost forever if they weren't careful. He never thought he'd actually be standing in front of one. "We need to turn back," Sean whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now!" But before any of them could move, Ryan had already walked ahead of them, past the three of them, heading straight for one of the stalls with an empty, glassy stare, like someone sleepwalking. The stall Ryan approached looked quieter than the others. Inside sat an old woman, wrapped in a worn, dark shawl, her face so pale it was almost gray. When she looked at Ryan, her eyes were solid black, no white visible at all, nothing like a human eye. The old woman smiled, showing crooked teeth, some of them blackened. She picked up a glass from behind her counter, filled it with a dark liquid that gave off a thin curl of steam, and held it out to Ryan. "Drink up, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was soft but wrong, like two voices speaking at once, slightly out of sync. Ryan, still half-conscious, reached out with a trembling hand and took the glass. The others were only a few steps behind him, and they watched all of it happen in a handful of seconds that somehow felt much slower than real time. Alex felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. He remembered something he'd once heard about places like this. Never accept anything from something you meet where it shouldn't exist. Take it, touch it, and you don't get to go home whole again. The glass was almost at Ryan's lips.
Alex moved without thinking. He lunged forward and knocked the glass out of Ryan's hand as hard as he could. It hit the ground and shattered, the dark liquid inside splashing and sinking into the dirt almost instantly, like the ground itself was pulling it under. What happened in the next second was something Alex would remember for the rest of his life. Every sound stopped. The haggling, the clinking plates, the laughter, all of it cut out at once, like someone had hit mute. What replaced it was a silence far heavier than anything they'd felt in the woods before. One by one, the figures in the market stopped what they were doing. Their heads turned, all at once, toward the four hikers. There was no anger on their faces, no expression at all. Just blank stares, all fixed on the shattered glass on the ground. The old woman rose slowly from her stall, her black eyes locking onto Alex. For the first time since they'd arrived, the ordinary night market feeling in the air turned into something far more threatening. "You rejected a gift," the old woman said, her voice no longer soft. "That's not polite, sweetheart." Alex knew they had to act fast. He remembered another story about how to apologize to things like this when someone made a mistake on their turf. With shaking hands, he dug into his pocket and pulled out a few coins he always carried for emergencies on the trail. He threw the coins onto the ground in front of the stall as an offering of apology, the way he'd once heard it should be done. "Sorry," he said quickly, his voice shaking. "We didn't mean to. We're just passing through." For a moment, nothing happened. Every figure in the market stayed still, staring down at the coins scattered on the ground. Then, without warning, the oil lamps along the stalls began going out, one by one, starting from the farthest stall and working their way closer. "Run!" Alex shouted, grabbing Ryan's arm, who was still barely conscious. The four of them bolted, leaving the market slowly sinking into darkness behind them. Ben held Ryan up from the other side, while Sean ran ahead, sweeping his headlamp across a trail he wasn't even sure led anywhere anymore. Their escape wasn't easy. About 10 minutes after fleeing the market, Sean, running in front, stopped so suddenly the others nearly crashed into him. Ahead of them, standing among the trees on both sides of the trail, were figures dressed head to toe in black. There was no telling how many, since the headlamp could only light up a fraction of them at a time. What was clear was that they stood completely rigid, not moving at all, like statues someone had deliberately placed among the trees. Their faces stayed hidden in shadow, even with the light aimed directly at them. "Don't look at them," Alex whispered, his voice nearly lost under his own ragged breathing. "Just keep walking. Don't look." They moved slowly, hugging the opposite side of the trail from the figures, keeping as much distance as they could. Ben felt like he was being watched from every direction, though he didn't dare turn to check. Every time they passed one of the figures, the air around it turned noticeably colder, like the temperature near them didn't follow the same rules as the rest of the forest. They made it past the line of black figures without incident, but the calm didn't last. Sean saw her first. To the left of the trail, pressed flat against the trunk of a massive tree, was the shape of a woman in a position that made no sense. Her body clung to the bark, as if she'd climbed it using her entire body instead of her legs. Her long hair hung tangled and loose, dangling downward because her head was upside down, facing the ground while the rest of her body faced up along the trunk. Her eyes, which should have been looking toward the ground given her inverted head, were instead locked wide open, staring straight at Sean, as if the angle of her neck didn't follow any rule of human anatomy at all. Sean froze for a few seconds, unable to make a sound. Ben, noticing his friend had stopped, turned to look at the same spot and immediately held his breath. "Don't stop," Alex said, having seen it too, but forcing himself to keep his eyes forward. "Keep walking. Don't run. Don't look again." They kept moving at a pace they forced themselves to keep steady, even as their hearts pounded far faster than their footsteps. Every so often they heard rustling in the leaves around them, like something following at a distance, but none of them dared check the source. Ryan, who'd been dead weight against Ben's shoulder for most of the run, slowly started coming back to himself, though his face was still pale and his breathing still uneven. He didn't remember much about what happened at the market, just a hazy sense of an old woman and a glass being held out to him. They kept walking for hours without stopping, only pausing briefly now and then to make sure nothing was following from behind. Slowly, the sky on the eastern horizon began to shift, from solid black to dark gray, a sign that dawn wasn't far off. The strange sounds that had followed them all night began to thin out, then disappeared completely as light started to filter through the gaps in the trees. The night insects that had gone silent hours earlier came back to life, as if the forest was returning to normal. Ben was the first to spot something familiar in the distance. A small structure with a tin roof, the kind used as a ranger station near the trailhead. "That's the ranger station," he said, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "We're almost there." They picked up the pace, even though their bodies were nearly done, after a full night of walking without rest. When they finally reached the station, a ranger who'd worked that trail for years stepped outside and froze at the sight of them. The ranger, a middle-aged man whose face was weathered from years on the mountain, went pale the moment he saw the four of them, filthy, soaked in sweat, faces still holding on to the fear from the night before. "You boys came down last night?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Alex nodded, too exhausted to explain much of anything. The ranger looked them over, one by one, like he was counting to make sure everyone standing in front of him was really there and not something else. "You didn't know, did you?" he said quietly. "Last night was a thin veil night." The four hikers exchanged looks, not fully understanding what he meant, though something in the way he said it sent a fresh chill down their spines. "Folks around here have called it that for generations," the ranger went on. "That's the night the line between our world and the other side gets thin as paper. Not just on this mountain, but this stretch. This is supposed to be the thinnest point in the whole Appalachian range." He told them there had been cases like this before. Hikers reckless enough to come down the mountain on exactly that night, and not all of them made it back safe. Some were found days later, dazed, unable to explain what had happened. Others were never found at all. "You're lucky all four of you are still here," he said, glancing at Ryan, still pale and weak. "But I'd get that one checked out if I were you, not just for his body." Alex looked over at Ryan, who'd been quiet this whole time, staring blankly at the forest they'd just left behind. There was something different in that stare, something Alex couldn't put into words, but it was enough to make him feel like their night wasn't fully over yet. They went their separate ways a few days later, back to their own lives. Ben, Sean, and Alex slowly eased back into their normal routines, though none of them could quite shake what they'd seen that night. Ryan was never quite the same. He rarely talked about that night, but a few months later his friends started noticing something off. Every time he passed a store or a stand selling anything with a dark-colored drink, he'd stop for a moment, staring at it a beat too long, before moving on like nothing had happened. No one could say for certain whether something had actually followed them home that night, or whether some part of Ryan had simply been left behind at that market. What was certain was one thing all four of them agreed on, without ever saying it out loud. They would never hike that mountain again, and they would never, under any circumstances, come down a mountain after dark.